The morning sun painted Manhattan's skyline in shades of amber and gold. From the 60th floor of Sterling Tower, Nathan Sterling stood behind floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up below. His reflection stared back at him, sharp jawline, dark hair perfectly styled, gray eyes that missed nothing. At 35, he commanded a tech empire worth $12 billion. Yet something hollow echoed in his chest each morning. Sterling Innovations had revolutionized artificial intelligence and robotics. What started in his college dorm room had grown into a company that employed thousands. Nathan's name appeared on magazine covers with titles like Genius Who Changed Everything and America's Most Eligible Bachelor. But behind the glossy photographs and glowing articles lived a man who had forgotten how to feel. The heart of his world, Grace Chen, moved through Nathan's outer office like poetry in motion. At 28, she possessed an elegance that came not from expensive clothes, but from genuine kindness. Her long black hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore simple but professional outfits that somehow made her stand out in a world of designer suits. For 4 years, Grace had been Nathan's executive assistant, but she was so much more. She anticipated his needs before he voiced them, smoothed conflicts before they erupted, and created order from the chaos of running a billion-dollar company. She remembered his mother's birthday when he forgot, ensured he ate lunch during marathon meetings, and somehow made his cold office feel warmer just by being there. Grace knew Nathan's schedule better than he did. She understood which investors made him tense and would quietly adjust meeting times to give him breathing room. When he worked late, she would leave his favorite green tea on his desk with a small note reminding him to go home. These tiny gestures went unnoticed by Nathan, who saw them as simply part of her job. What Nathan didn't know was that Grace had fallen in love with him months ago. Not with his money or power, but with glimpses of the man beneath the armor. She saw how he donated anonymously to children's hospitals, how he personally called the family of every employee who faced a crisis, and how his eyes softened when he thought no one was watching. The storm clouds gather. The trouble began with a competitor's aggressive move. TechFlow Industries, led by the ruthless Vincent Walsh, had been stealing Sterling's clients and employees. They offered higher salaries and promised faster innovation. The board of directors was getting nervous, and investors were asking hard questions about Sterling's future. Nathan felt the pressure mounting like a vice around his chest. He worked 18-hour days, snapped at employees, and pushed everyone around him to their limits. The stress was changing him, making him harder and more demanding than ever. Grace watched this transformation with growing concern. She tried to help by reorganizing his schedule to include breaks, bringing him healthier meals, and gently suggesting he delegate more responsibilities. But Nathan was too consumed by fear of failure to notice her efforts. The moment everything changed, the emergency board meeting was scheduled for a cold Tuesday morning in November. Nathan had asked Grace to prepare a comprehensive report on the company's financial position and competitive analysis. She had worked until 3 in the morning, cross-referencing data and creating detailed presentations. But that same night, Grace's younger brother Tommy had been rushed to the hospital with appendicitis. Grace spent hours in the emergency room, holding her worried mother's hand and coordinating with doctors. By the time she knew Tommy would be okay, it was already dawn, and she had to choose between sleep and perfecting Nathan's presentation. She chose Nathan, as she always did. Grace arrived at the office with tired eyes and slightly wrinkled clothes, carrying the presentation she had finished in the hospital waiting room. The boardroom was already full of stern-faced directors and nervous executives. Nathan sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, his expression unreadable. "The quarterly analysis, Mr. Sterling," Grace said quietly, placing the folder in front of him. Nathan opened it and immediately noticed a small error in one of the charts. The competitor's market share was listed as 23% instead of 32%. It was a minor mistake that didn't affect the overall analysis, but in his stressed state, it felt like a betrayal. "This is wrong," he said coldly, not looking at her. "I apologize, sir." "I can correct it immediately," Grace replied, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. But Nathan was beyond reason. The pressure from the board, the fear of losing his company, and months of stress erupted in that moment. He stood up slowly, his gray eyes turning to ice. "For 4 years, you've been perfect. Every detail, every deadline, every crisis managed flawlessly. And now, when everything depends on precision, you give me this?" His voice was quiet, but cut like a blade. The boardroom fell silent. Grace stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her. "I trusted you completely," Nathan continued, his words falling like stones. "But trust, once broken, cannot be repaired. In business, there are no second chances for failure." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a severance letter he had prepared for another employee who never showed up. Without hesitation, he signed it and slid it across the polished table. "Your services are no longer required." The weight of silence. Grace looked down at the letter, then back at Nathan. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, hurt so deep it made several board members shift uncomfortably. But she didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't defend herself. "I understand," she said simply. She picked up the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in her purse. Then she walked to Nathan's chair and set her master key card and company phone on the table beside him. "I'll clear my desk within the hour," she said. As Grace turned to leave, Nathan felt something twist in his chest. He watched her walk toward the door, noting the slight sag in her shoulders, the way she held her head high despite everything. For just a moment, he wanted to call her back, to ask about the circles under her eyes and why her usual grace seemed strained. But pride and fear kept him silent. The door closed with a soft click, and Grace Chen walked out of Nathan Sterling's life. The immediate aftermath. The board meeting continued, but the energy had shifted. Several directors glanced at Nathan with something that looked like disappointment. Margaret Thornton, the oldest member of the board and a woman Nathan respected deeply, spoke first. "That seemed unusually harsh, Nathan. Grace has been exemplary for years. One mistake is all it takes to bring down an empire." Nathan replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sometimes," Margaret said quietly, "the mistake isn't in the work. It's in forgetting that behind every perfect performance is a human being." Nathan spent the rest of the meeting trying to focus on financial projections and market strategies, but his mind kept drifting to Grace's face in that final moment. By the time the meeting ended, a strange emptiness had settled in his chest. He returned to his office to find Grace's desk completely cleared. Her computer was logged out, her personal photos removed. Even the small plant she had cared for was gone. The space looked sterile and cold, like a hotel room waiting for the next guest. On his own desk, Nathan found a single manila folder. Inside was the corrected presentation, perfect in every detail, along with a comprehensive transition document explaining every system, every contact, and every process Grace had managed. Even in leaving, she had tried to make things easier for him. At the bottom of the transition document, in Grace's neat handwriting, were 4 words that would haunt Nathan for weeks to come. "Thank you for everything." The first cracks that evening, Nathan sat in his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. The space was magnificent, filled with expensive art and modern furniture, but it felt as empty as a museum after hours. He poured himself a glass of 30-year-old scotch and tried to convince himself he had made the right decision. But for the first time in years, Nathan Sterling felt truly alone. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Haven't heard from you in weeks, darling. How about dinner this Sunday?" Nathan stared at the message, realizing he couldn't remember the last time he had called her. Grace used to remind him about these things, scheduling regular calls and suggesting thoughtful gifts for holidays. Without her gentle prompts, he had simply forgotten the people who mattered most. He set down his phone without responding and walked to the window. The city sparkled below him like a circuit board, beautiful but cold. Somewhere out there, Grace was probably home with her family, perhaps taking care of her sick brother or comforting her worried mother. For the first time, Nathan wondered what Grace's life was like outside the office. In 4 years, he had never asked about her family, her dreams, or her fears. She had known everything about his world, but he had known almost nothing about hers. The scotch tasted bitter on his tongue, and Nathan found himself missing something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just Grace's efficiency or her ability to manage his schedule. It was something deeper, something that had made his days feel less mechanical and more human. As snow began to fall outside his window, Nathan Sterling realized he might have just made the biggest mistake of his life. But pride is a powerful prison, and he wasn't ready to admit that yet. The golden tower that housed his empire suddenly felt less like a castle and more like a cage, beautiful but empty, successful but hollow. And somewhere in the silence of his perfect apartment, Nathan began to understand that all the money in the world couldn't buy back what he had just thrown away. The city lights blurred as exhaustion finally caught up with him, but sleep wouldn't come easily. Instead, Nathan lay awake thinking about kind eyes and gentle efficiency, about the warmth that had quietly left his world, and about the growing certainty that he had just lost something infinitely more valuable than any business deal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressures, and the stark reality of life without Grace Chen. But tonight, in the darkness of his empty penthouse, Nathan Sterling began the slow journey toward understanding what he had really lost. The fortune he had built suddenly felt less golden and more like the bars of a prison he had created for himself. 3 weeks had passed since Grace left Sterling Innovations, and the cracks in Nathan's perfect world were spreading like frost on a winter window. He sat in his office at 7 in the morning, staring at a calendar that had become his enemy. Double-booked meetings, missed conference calls, and forgotten appointments littered his schedule like landmines waiting to explode. His temporary assistant, Jennifer, was competent but lacked Grace's intuitive understanding of his world. She followed instructions perfectly, but couldn't anticipate his needs or smooth the rough edges that Grace had polished without him even noticing. The difference was like comparing a player piano to a symphony orchestra. Nathan's coffee sat cold on his desk, bitter and forgotten. Grace had always known to add just a touch of honey and a splash of cream, adjusting the mixture until it matched his exact preference. Now he couldn't even remember how she had made it taste so perfect. His phone buzzed with an angry text from a major investor who had been waiting in the lobby for 20 minutes for a meeting Nathan had completely forgotten. This was the third such incident this week, and Nathan's reputation for precision was beginning to crumble. Grace's new dawn across town in Brooklyn. Grace Chen walked through the doors of Sunshine Community Center, a modest building that served underprivileged children in the neighborhood. The walls were painted in cheerful colors, covered with children's artwork and motivational posters. The air smelled like crayons and hope, so different from the sterile perfection of Sterling Tower. Grace had discovered this place by accident, volunteering to help her neighbor's daughter with homework. What started as a favor had become a calling. She used her organizational skills to help the center run more efficiently, creating systems for tutoring schedules, meal programs, and after-school activities. The children loved her immediately. Grace had a gentle way of explaining difficult concepts, and her patience seemed limitless. She helped 10-year-old Marcus learn to read, taught teenager Destiny how to prepare for college applications, and somehow made even the most challenging kids feel valued and heard. "Miss Grace, you're like magic," said little Rosa, a 7-year-old whose parents worked 3 jobs between them. "You make everything better." Grace smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that she had never experienced in the corporate world. Here, her efforts directly improved lives. She could see the impact in bright smiles, improved grades, and growing confidence. These children didn't care about her efficiency or professional skills. They cared about her kindness and attention. The breaking point Nathan's world continued to unravel. A crucial client meeting went disastrously wrong when he arrived with the wrong presentation. A partnership deal fell through because he missed a key deadline. His competitors began circling like sharks, sensing weakness in the formerly unshakable Sterling empire. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. Margaret Thornton looked at Nathan with disappointment rather than anger, which somehow hurt more. "Nathan, Sterling Innovations is bleeding talent and losing clients. Your personal assistant situation was supposed to be temporary, but it's been weeks. What's your plan?" Nathan straightened his tie, a nervous habit he thought he had conquered years ago. "I'm interviewing candidates. We'll have someone in place soon." "It's not just about replacing Grace," interjected board member Robert Hayes. "It's about the change in your leadership. You're distracted, disorganized, and frankly, you seem lost." The words hit Nathan like physical blows. He had built his identity around being in control, being perfect, being untouchable. Now he felt like a ship without an anchor, drifting in dangerous waters. A mother's wisdom that evening, Nathan finally returned his mother's calls. Patricia Sterling lived in an elegant townhouse on the Upper East Side, surrounded by books and memories of her late husband. At 62, she remained sharp and observant, with silver hair and kind eyes that missed nothing. "You look terrible," she said bluntly as Nathan entered her living room. "Thanks, Mom. Always the diplomat," Nathan replied, attempting his usual charm. Patricia wasn't having it. She gestured for him to sit in the chair across from her, the same spot where she had lectured him as a child. Some things never changed. "Tell me about Grace," she said simply. Nathan's facade cracked slightly. "What about her?" "Oh, please. I may be old, but I'm not blind. For 4 years, that girl called me before every holiday, remembered my birthday, and sent flowers when I was sick. She knew more about your life than you did, and she cared enough to include your mother in it." Nathan felt heat creep up his neck. He had never known about Grace's calls to his mother. Patricia continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Your father built his fortune, but he never forgot that business is about people. You've become so afraid of appearing weak that you've forgotten how to be human. I fired her because she made a mistake," Nathan said defensively. "No," Patricia replied, rising from her chair. "You fired her because she was the only person who saw past your armor, and that terrified you." She walked to a bookshelf and pulled out a photo album. Inside were pictures of Nathan as a child, laughing and carefree, before tragedy had taught him that vulnerability was dangerous. "Your father died when you were 17, and you decided that loving people meant losing them. So you built walls. But those walls don't just keep pain out, Nathan. They keep love out too." Nathan stared at the photos, seeing a boy he barely remembered. When had he stopped laughing like that? When had joy become such a foreign concept? The investigation unable to sleep that night, Nathan found himself doing something he had never done before, researching Grace's life outside his office. He discovered that she had graduated summa cum laude from Columbia with a degree in social work before switching to business. She had wanted to help people, but had needed the higher salary of corporate work to support her family. Her younger brother Tommy was a sophomore at NYU studying medicine. Her parents ran a small restaurant in Chinatown, working 16-hour days to make ends meet. Grace had been sending most of her salary home. living in a tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn, while maintaining the polished professional appearance Nathan's world demanded. The weight of his ignorance crashed down on him. For 4 years, Grace had managed his life with perfect efficiency, while juggling family responsibilities and financial pressures he had never bothered to learn about. She had made his world run smoothly, while her own world required constant sacrifice and struggle. A chance encounter the next Saturday, Nathan found himself walking through Brooklyn, something he had never done before. He told himself he was exploring investment opportunities, but his steps led him inevitably toward Grace's neighborhood. He saw her before she saw him, sitting on a park bench reading to a group of children from the community center. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she wore jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual business attire. She looked younger, more relaxed, genuinely happy in a way he had never seen during their years together. Nathan watched from a distance as Grace helped a little boy sound out difficult words, her patience infinite as he struggled with each syllable. When the boy finally read a complete sentence, Grace's face lit up with pure joy, and she hugged him tightly. The scene stirred something deep in Nathan's chest, a longing for the kind of simple, honest connection he had spent years avoiding. He turned and walked away before Grace could notice him, but the image stayed with him for the rest of the day. The confession that night, Nathan called his best friend from college, David Park, now a successful doctor in California. They had remained close despite the distance, and David was one of the few people who could speak honestly to Nathan without fear of consequences. "I think I ruined my life," Nathan said without preamble when David answered. "Well, hello to you too. What happened?" Nathan told him everything. The firing, the chaos at work, his mother's words, and his realization about Grace's life outside the office. David listened without interruption, then spoke carefully. "So you fired the woman you were falling in love with because you were scared of needing her?" "I wasn't falling in love with her," Nathan protested automatically. "Really? Then why are you calling me at midnight, sounding like someone died? Why are you stalking her neighborhood like a lovesick teenager? And why do you know her family's entire financial situation by heart after one night of research?" The truth hit Nathan like a physical blow. Somewhere in the 4 years of shared glances and quiet efficiency, of Grace's gentle care and invisible support, he had fallen completely in love with her. But he had been so terrified of that vulnerability that he had destroyed it the moment it threatened his control. "What do I do?" Nathan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You figure out who you want to be," David replied. "The scared boy hiding behind money and power, or the man who's brave enough to love someone more than he loves his own safety. The mirror's truth." Nathan hung up the phone and walked to his bathroom mirror. The man staring back looked tired and hollow, successful but empty. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to really see what he had become. He thought about Grace's gentle smile, her quiet strength, the way she had made his cold office feel like home. He thought about the children in the park, how they had looked at her with pure love and trust. He thought about his mother's words and David's challenge. The walls he had built to protect himself had become a prison. His fear of loss had guaranteed that loss. His pursuit of control had led to chaos. But perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps love, once broken, could be rebuilt stronger than before. Perhaps vulnerability wasn't weakness, but the greatest strength of all. Nathan Sterling looked in the mirror and made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would begin the hardest journey of his life, learning how to be human again. The fortune that had defined him suddenly seemed less important than the heart he had forgotten he possessed. And somewhere across the city, Grace Chen continued to spread light in the darkness, unaware that her former boss was finally beginning to understand what she had always known, that the greatest wealth comes not from what we accumulate, but from what we give away. Nathan Sterling stood at the entrance of Sunshine Community Center, his palms sweating despite the cool November air. He had traded his usual $1,000 suit for jeans and a simple sweater, but he still felt overdressed and out of place. Through the glass doors, he could see children laughing and playing, their joy a stark contrast to the sterile corporate world he knew so well. He had spent 2 weeks preparing for this moment, not with presentations or strategies, but with research into what the center needed and how he could help without making it about himself. This wasn't about winning Grace back with grand gestures or impressive donations. This was about becoming the kind of man who deserved her love. The center's director, Maria Santos, was a warm woman in her 50s who had dedicated her life to helping underprivileged children. She greeted Nathan with curiosity rather than the deference he was used to receiving. "Mr. Sterling, right? Grace mentioned you might be stopping by. What brings you to our little corner of Brooklyn?" Nathan had rehearsed this conversation, but standing here surrounded by children's artwork and the sound of genuine laughter, his prepared words felt hollow. Instead, he spoke from his heart. "I want to help, but not with money. I want to volunteer. I want to learn what it means to serve others instead of being served." Maria studied him carefully. She had seen wealthy benefactors before, people who wrote checks to ease their conscience, but never got their hands dirty. Something in Nathan's eyes, however, suggested this was different. "We can always use extra hands," she said slowly. "But I have to warn you, this isn't about tax write-offs or photo opportunities. These kids need consistency and genuine care. Can you provide that?" "I can try," Nathan replied honestly. "I'm not good at this yet, but I want to learn." Learning to serve Nathan's first day as a volunteer was humbling in ways he never expected. He was assigned to help with homework in the elementary room, where Grace usually worked with the younger children. 8-year-old Carlos looked up at him skeptically. "Are you rich?" Carlos asked bluntly. "Why do you ask that?" Nathan replied, genuinely curious. "You smell expensive. And your hands are soft like you never worked." Nathan looked down at his manicured hands, realizing how obvious his privileged life must be to these children who understood struggle in ways he never had. "You're right," he admitted. "I am rich, and I haven't done much real work with my hands. But I'm here to learn." Carlos considered this and handed Nathan a math worksheet. "Okay, but if you're gonna help, you gotta be good at it." This is important. The simple honesty of children became Nathan's greatest teacher. They didn't care about his net worth or business achievements. They cared whether he listened when they talked, whether he celebrated their small victories, and whether he showed up consistently. Nathan struggled at first. He was impatient when children couldn't grasp concepts quickly, frustrated by the noise and chaos that seemed to energize Grace, but overwhelmed him. But slowly, day by day, he began to understand. Grace's dilemma. Grace watched Nathan's transformation with a mixture of hope and skepticism. She had seen him at his worst, cold and calculating, willing to destroy someone's livelihood over a minor mistake. Yet here he was, patiently helping little Rosa sound out words, celebrating when Marcus finally understood fractions, and staying late to clean up after craft time. The children adored him. Nathan had a gift for explaining complex ideas in simple terms, a skill that translated perfectly from boardrooms to classrooms. He brought the same intensity to helping a child with reading that he once brought to closing million-dollar deals. But Grace guarded her heart carefully. She had rebuilt her life around serving others and finding fulfillment beyond Nathan's approval. She wouldn't let herself hope for something that might disappear as quickly as it had appeared. "He's different now," Maria observed one evening as they watched Nathan teaching 10-year-old Destiny how to code on an old computer. "People don't really change," Grace replied quietly. "They just find new ways to get what they want." But even as she said the words, Grace wasn't sure she believed them. The man patiently debugging code with a curious child bore little resemblance to the CEO who had dismissed her so coldly. The revelation: 3 months into his volunteer work, Nathan was helping prepare Thanksgiving dinner for the families at the center. He found himself working alongside Grace for the first time since that terrible day in the boardroom. They moved carefully around each other, polite but distant. Grace was teaching several teenagers how to make traditional Filipino lumpia, sharing stories of her grandmother's recipes. Nathan watched her gentle guidance, the way she made each young person feel capable and valued. This was who Grace truly was when freed from the constraints of corporate expectations. "She's amazing with them," said Destiny, the teenager Nathan had been teaching to code. "Miss Grace saved my life, you know." Nathan looked at the 16-year-old with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I was going to drop out of school, maybe get into some bad stuff. But Miss Grace, she saw something in me nobody else did. She helped me apply for scholarships, taught me how to dream bigger than my neighborhood." Nathan felt a familiar twist in his chest. Even here, Grace was changing lives with her quiet strength and unwavering belief in others. Later, as they cleaned up together, Nathan finally found the courage to speak. "Grace, I need you to know something." She continued wiping down tables, not looking at him. "Nathan, we don't need to do this." "Yes, we do." His voice was steady but vulnerable. "I was wrong. Not just about firing you, but about everything. I spent 4 years taking your kindness for granted, treating you like a machine instead of a person. You deserved better." Grace finally looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You hurt me, Nathan, deeper than you know." "I know," he said simply. "And I can't undo that. But I can try to become the kind of man who would never hurt you again." To test Nathan's words might have been sincere, but Grace needed proof beyond his presence at the community center. That proof came during the center's annual Christmas fundraiser, when a kitchen fire threatened to cancel the event that provided holiday meals for 50 families. The damage was extensive, and the insurance wouldn't cover the full repairs in time for Christmas. Maria was devastated, knowing that many of the families counted on this meal as their only Christmas celebration. Grace worked frantically to find solutions, calling suppliers and other community centers, but the timeline was impossible. As Christmas approached, it seemed the event would have to be canceled. Nathan could have simply written a check to solve the problem, but he knew that wasn't what Grace or the community needed. Instead, he used his business connections differently. He convinced restaurant owners throughout the city to donate kitchen time and ingredients. He organized Sterling Innovation employees to volunteer there for Christmas Eve. He turned his corporate network into a web of community support. Most importantly, he worked alongside everyone else, not as the wealthy donor orchestrating from above, but as one volunteer among many. Grace watched him scrub pots, serve meals, and distribute gifts with no cameras present, no media coverage, just genuine service. The moment of truth on Christmas morning, as the last family left the center with full bellies and happy children, Grace and Nathan found themselves alone in the decorated hall. The lights twinkled softly, and the scent of pine from the donated Christmas tree filled the air. "Why?" Grace asked suddenly. "Why did you really come here?" Nathan sat down heavily in one of the small chairs, looking exhausted but peaceful. "Because I realized that everything I thought made me successful actually made me empty. Because I discovered that the woman I fired wasn't just my assistant, she was the best part of my world. And because I fell in love with you somewhere between your first day of work and your last, but I was too scared to admit it." Grace's breath caught. In all her fantasies of this conversation, she had never expected such raw honesty. "Nathan, I can't go back to being invisible in your world." "I'm not asking you to," he said, rising to face her. "I'm asking if we can build something new together. Not employer and employee, but partners. In the center, in life, in love." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Grace's eyes widened. "This isn't a business proposal," Nathan said, his voice trembling slightly. "This is me, just Nathan, not the CEO or the billionaire, asking Grace Chen, the woman who taught me what it means to love, if she'll marry me." The ring was simple and elegant, nothing like the flashy displays of wealth Grace might have expected. It was chosen with love, not price in mind. The answer Grace looked at the ring, then at Nathan's face, reading the genuine transformation in his eyes. She thought of the cold man who had fired her, then of the patient volunteer who had spent months proving his change was real. "Ask me again in a year," she said softly. Nathan's face fell slightly, but Grace continued. "If you're still here, still serving, still the man you've become rather than the man you were, ask me again. Love isn't just a feeling, Nathan. It's a choice you make every day." Nathan nodded, understanding the wisdom in her words. He put the ring away without argument. "I'll wait," he said simply. "However long it takes." The new beginning 1 year later, Nathan knelt again in the same community center, surrounded by the children and families they both served. This time, when he asked Grace to marry him, her answer was different. "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, because you kept your promise. Yes, because you became the man I always hoped you could be." The center erupted in cheers as the children who had watched their love story unfold celebrated the happy ending they had all been rooting for. Nathan Sterling had finally learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the love shared, the lives touched, and the hearts changed. And Grace Chun had found a partner who valued not just her efficiency, but her soul. Their wedding was held not in a fancy hotel, but in the community center where they had rediscovered what mattered most. Surrounded by family, friends, and the children who had taught them both about unconditional love, they began their new life together. The billionaire had found his heart, and the secretary had found her voice. Together, they would build an empire not of money and power, but of service and love. And in that kingdom, they would both be royalty. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Nathan whispered in Grace's ear, "Thank you for teaching me that the best investment I ever made was in learning to love." Grace smiled, her heart full. "Thank you for proving that people can change, that love can heal, and that sometimes the greatest fortunes are found not in bank accounts, but in each other." Outside the windows of the community center, snow began to fall like a blessing over the city. And inside, two hearts that had found each other created a warmth that would last a lifetime.